trying to come in alone. Shoot! Yanni, baby! He wins it for the Lightning! 5-4 in overtime!
Taylor the shot, redirected, score! Game 7, Montana St. Louis! We are going back to Tampa Bay! A Cavalier spinning, a Cavalier looking, trying to drop it off, brings it in himself, left it in the middle, shot, score!
Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Thunderstruck with your host Philip Wonderly, co-host Jake Ricker, and the newest co-host Michael Wack. What's going on, guys?
Nothing much. How you doing, Phil?
I'm doing good, man. How are you, Mike?
Good. It's definitely a whirlwind right now, but we're managing this as best we can.
Yeah, that's what you kind of got to do right now. It's pretty hectic out there, the coronavirus and everything like that. I just went to the store yesterday and the shelves were empty, let alone hockey, but that's real life too, what we're living in right now. So going to hockey though, there was recently a pause, and Gary Bettman said that he wants to award the cup, but he also wants to take it day by day. So far, this whole week has been postponed. What do you guys kind of think about that so far?
Yeah, it's shocking to say the least, because this is something that we have not seen ever almost. The only other time the NHL was canceled was back in 1919 when there was an outbreak of the Spanish flu. The NHL completely canceled the Stanley Cup Finals when that happened, and they declared no champion. But luckily for right now, this is just a postponage. They have not shut down the entire league. So, I think they're going to wait and see how this plays out, depending on how this keeps spreading, if it gets worse. So we really don't know how a lot of this is going to play out. But, I think they made the right call here in shutting things down and postponing it, because, as we've seen, it's not just the NHL that shut down. It's the NHL, the MLB, the Masters, the NCAA canceled their tournament completely. So, everybody's gone into basically a over precaution mode to try and get this to end as quickly as possible so we can get back to the way things were before.
If you read the notice that Gary Bettman sent out to everybody, it really, because he's a lawyer, it had a lot of lawyeristic language. But it was probably one of the best things the NHL has done public relations-wise in a while, because, a lot of us complain about Gary Bettman and the way that the league is run and how they decide on things. But in this virus, I really feel like this is something that they could show the entire North American side of things, that we're not joking around, and we're going to help our public image, and we're also going to help our players, our fans. We're showing that even with the decisions that we've made in the past, our fans and our players and the health and well-being of our game comes first.
Yeah, that's kind of the most important thing. We want your people to be safe, not only your athletes, but as you mentioned, the fans too. When you got to take those extreme measures sometimes, especially when things like this arise.
I think it's important to note, too, that for fans is that, as I mentioned before, these games are not canceled, though. And that's the nicest thing. And this could, at the end of the day, which I think is important to talk about, it benefit the Lightning here. So, obviously for teams like us with injuries, with Stamkos, Hedman, some of our top guys, they're going to have time to rest. And whereas before we were looking at Stamkos potentially coming back first round of the playoffs, maybe even later into the playoffs, he could now be there for that first round for sure, depending on how long this goes. So, this could benefit the Lightning. So if you want to look at this in a positive light, that's something for Lightning fans to consider.
When I did the article for you guys yesterday, how I looked at this was, this could actually be beneficiary for the NHL in terms of how their playoff hockey looks, because, NHL playoff hockey is outstanding on its own, but a fully healthy NHL hockey playoffs would be just unbelievable, because you've got people like Mark Stone for Vegas, and got injuries to Dougie Hamilton for Carolina and Jake Muzzin for the Leafs and Steven Stamkos for our Tampa Bay Lightning, if those guys are able to come back, Hamilton maybe not because he's got a broken leg, but Brett Pesce is another one on the Hurricanes. If those guys are able to come back at full strength for the playoffs, that's adding more excitement because those are some of the top players in the game.
Right. And that's the thing, too. Like you mentioned, the injuries are really killing a lot of teams right now. They have a lot of their stars out. And as you mentioned, we had Steven Stamkos out for a while. He was supposed to be back in the second round of playoffs, but the way that things are looking, he might be ready to go in game one.
That's definitely the hope, and we'll see how long this goes on for. And obviously, we want Stamkos at 110%, so he may sit out a couple of rounds still, but a lot is up in the air. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. It also could end up too where the NHL, if this goes on long enough, could just play the playoffs by the time this ends. If this, this postponage goes on for long enough. So I think it's also something to consider too is that, we don't know what's going to happen. This could end up being, a completely different situation here in the next couple of months. So although we hope that things just get postponed and we can resume things as normal soon enough, and this does benefit the Lightning, this could go the complete opposite way, and we could be playing the playoffs before we know it.
Yeah, and that's the thing too. Like you said, you don't really know when the playoffs are going to start. Are they going to start right away? Are they going to reverse games? What I mean by that is the week that are postponed, if they play at the end of the year. What do you got to say about this, Mike?
Yeah, so with the people that we have out currently, like Stamkos, Hedman, even like Jan Ruda, I didn't even know how good of a player he could be until this past year. But I kind of feel like if we look at it in terms of the NHL is going to start their playoffs as soon as the virus is contained, I think a lot of other teams would be upset. You've got teams like in the Eastern Conference, the New York Rangers and the Florida Panthers that are both vying for playoff spots. So, and they're only about a game out, and I think they have games in hand on their respective teams that they're chasing. Or in the West, like Vancouver, Minnesota, Arizona, I feel like if the NHL is going to come back, they need to play a couple more games to get their feet under them, to solve these wild card and division issues, and then from there just go into the playoffs.
Now is if the playoffs would just not be existent and the teams, are at first already win the Stanley Cup, which that would be Boston, and we all know that we don't want Boston to win that cup.
I don't think they'll do that, thankfully, because that would be a bummer. So, and also I don't think that's what the NHL will do. If I think what they'll do is just push the league back because they asked teams to find out the arena availabilities going into July, I believe. So I think their goal is just to push back the season, and in hoping that this is not going to last very long. But I just think it's something to consider because, as we mentioned, we don't know what's going to happen. I think another thing, a big factor that we may not look at right now is how this is going to affect next season. Bettman made the statement today that he hopes, it was kind of a weird statement, but he said that he expects next season to be a normal season. But I think what he means by that is, depending on how late this season gets pushed back, that affects a lot of things. It gives guys a lot less time off in between. Already when you go to the Stanley Cup Finals, you don't have as much time before the next season starts, but you'll have even less time now, depending on how long this gets pushed back. That could affect things like free agency. It could affect things like the draft. There's a lot of things up in the air that we don't know how it could change depending on how long the season gets pushed back.
And, the worst comes to worst, and I know we don't want to think about this, but at the end of the day, this year could possibly just be canceled. And if that's the case, then at that point, you're giving the players more than enough time to recuperate for next season. But at the same time, if they decide to go on with it, go into July for a possible Stanley Cup Finals, and then giving the players maybe not less time, maybe there's a shortened season next year. Maybe they only play about 60 games. Maybe they play 50 games. maybe they treat this as what they did with the 2012-13 lockout when there were only 48 games. To be honest, like, we don't know because it's so unprecedented. And another thing I wonder too is, because of this postponement, would there be a chance that the NHL would say during this intermittent time, because there's 12 games left possibly, hey, we're going to lift the trade deadline and you guys can still make additions, improve your team, all that stuff? I think that would be really interesting if they did that. But also, if they do that, what was the purpose of having a trade deadline in the first place?
Yeah. And like you said, too, that, I mean, their trade deadline is in place for a reason. But at the same time, if it's extending that far, you don't really know. Like, maybe they can make trades all the way until May or so, because you don't know what's going to come back. So that's a good.
My guess would be that they wouldn't do that because the trade deadline already passed. If this was a scenario where the trade deadline was upcoming in just the next few days, then I could maybe see them extending it possibly, because obviously you're scouting players and whatnot. But that would definitely make things even more crazy than they already are if you've got teams then making trades right before the playoffs. But I personally don't think they would do that.
Another thing that you completely talked about that I completely forgot about was it's not just the players that aren't playing. The scouts are not scouting anymore. General managers probably aren't making calls. So at that rate, the entire league is basically on a shutdown. Unless you're Gary Bettman or someone on the board of governors, you don't really have anything to do, honestly.
And like you mentioned too, it's not only the players and stuff that are getting hurt. I guess you can't really say financially, but people that you kind of do have to look out for are the workers that are working like through concessions and whatever. But thankfully, a lot of teams have already came out and said, we're going to pay you until the end of this month and to see just how far it'll go. And then, it's kind of taking care of their workers.
Just, I guess, breaking news, but Joe Smith of The Athletic just posted an email that he got from Steve Griggs and Jeff Vinnick that said that the Vinnick Sports Group will compensate for part-time employees previously scheduled to work games in March. So everyone in the arena or people that are like parking lot attendants or whatnot, very thankful that they will have the source of income, even though there's going to be no games.
And we actually have someone that works for Bay Bolts too. John, he works as a bartender, so I was kind of worried about him too. But I'm glad that Jeff Vinnick stepped up and he said, we're going to do this for our employees. And so it was kind of expected too, because Vinnick's a great owner. So
he really showed that he's really committed to making the area a better place. I know that Mark Cuban was the first NBA owner. This was, I think, hours after Rudy Gobert was the first professional athlete to be diagnosed with coronavirus. Mark Cuban was the first owner to say that these workers are going to be compensated. Pretty sure all but one of the owners that have made a statement have said we're going to compensate. The only one that didn't was Bell MTS Place for the Jets, and they look really bad right now in the public eye.
I'm glad that they ended up doing this. I personally expected them to do this. It wasn't going to surprise me when they did do it. So it's good that finally came out. It's almost like, the reason I expect teams to do this too is because, as you mentioned, if you didn't do this, it would really hurt the organization and how you look as an owner, because so many teams are doing it. And you shouldn't ever do something like this because everybody else is doing it. It's obviously just the right thing to do. But I'm glad the Lightning are doing it, and that will definitely help these people in the long run, which is good to see.
So going away from the coronavirus here, we did play a couple games as well right before this hit. Played a game against Detroit. And what do you guys have to say about that game?
That was an interesting game, to say none the least. High-scoring game, 5-4 in the shootout. There were a couple frustrating points in that game, I know, with referees, but what else is new? I thought the Lightning played fine in that game. I know you're thinking it's against Detroit, the worst team in the league, with negative 120 goal differential. How could we lose to a team like that? But I think something very important to consider, just if you took away the teams of who we played on that because it was a back-to-back, both on the road, and we took 3 out of 4 possible points. That is always a positive, no matter who you're playing. And then you look at who we were playing too. We just played Boston. It was an extremely gritty game, a very physical game, one that I'm sure the guys were exhausted at. And then they played a almost afternoon game in Detroit. Not quite afternoon, but it was earlier in the day than most games. So this was, you got a time change. It's an earlier game. You were just playing a huge physical game. So with all odds stacked against the Lightning, they still very nearly won that game. They ended up losing in the shootout. And there was also a Kucherov goal that got called back that totally should have been a goal. So this game doesn't bother me at all, even though it was a loss to Detroit. I think they did a good job, all things considered.
Yeah, so I didn't end up watching this game. I was on a flight, but I did watch the highlights. And from what I saw, without Victor Hedman, I thought that they were going to have an uphill battle because Hedman didn't play the majority of the game against Boston. And it was really apparent that Ryan McDonagh was not ready to come back. And I'll get to this more in the Toronto game, but McDonagh looked kind of bad, to be honest. And I know like a lot of people have said that he's been pretty good since we got him, and he's been one of our rocks this year, and I was really sad to see him go down. But it just seemed like, and on paper, it was a perfect opportunity to bring him back. You're facing Detroit, and you need him to kind of get his feet back under him. But at the end of the day, like, he was on the ice for, I think it was 3 of the 4 goals in regulation, and all 3 of them he made some sort of either mistake or didn't cover somebody that he was supposed to be covering or let a pass through. It was just a really bad night for him and Eric Chernak. I thought that pairing was not great. But another problem that I saw throughout the highlights was some of the goals that McElhinney allowed were not great either. So to be honest, it was a game where I'm satisfied that we got a point. I'm satisfied with the road trip. As someone that went to the game the night before against Boston, I could tell the guys were going to be just beat up and just drained, and I'm glad they got a point. But the people that were refreshed didn't impress.
I think it's important to consider, too, with McDonagh. We've seen the Lightning before and how they've struggled with coming back from breaks. And I say that because, often after the All-Star break, the Lightning usually struggle for a couple of games. And this is something I didn't even consider when we were talking about the postpones of the game. You got to wonder how these teams are going to perform once if the season starts to pick up again. Are these guys going to struggle a lot like the Lightning often do when they have an extended period of time off? And that's why I wasn't overly concerned about McDonagh. I know he didn't play the greatest game, but he's definitely been huge for the Lightning. Yes, he didn't play well, but I think you got to give him the benefit of the doubt here. He hasn't played in so long, and I fully expect for a guy like him to pick his game right back up and get it to, where it was before he was injured.
Yeah, and he's been in the league for a long time too. He's played for all the Rangers for all those time, but like you said too, it's hard to come back from injury and then all of a sudden expect your player to be just as good as he was when he went down. So I think he has to get his feet under him a little bit. Maybe it's not the greatest pairing either with Cernak and McDonagh. So maybe you got to shake that up too when the season resumes.
And it was so strange. Like, before Hedman went down, I didn't mind the pairing between Hedman and Cernak. They weren't the greatest pairing, but for Sergachev to continue being a pair with Shattenkirk, and then your third pair is just whatever at that point. I haven't been keen on Braden Coburn, Luke Shen, and Zach Bogosian, but honestly, Zach Bogosian, at least in that game versus Boston and against Detroit and Toronto, he hasn't been that bad. He's actually been more impressive as the time has gone on. I think that's one thing that we have to consider is he was off for a really long time in Buffalo. They didn't play him. They sent him down. He didn't report. Then they cut him. So it was a long time before he really got an opportunity to play again. So for him, I've been slightly impressed. I don't know how he's going to bounce back after this long break. Same goes with all these guys. I don't know how they're going to bounce back after this long break. But as far as the pairings now, I think we're still okay. But one more big injury, this is going to be a problem.
Well, and that's why this break ends up benefiting us so much, because luckily, most of these guys should be able to come back once this break is up. So if there is another injury, God forbid, at the end of the season here, hopefully at that point everybody will have been back, so we're only losing one guy at that point.
Yeah, and going back to Bogosian too, you don't really know what's going through his head too, going through all that stuff. I mean, that might take a lot on you mentally, and now you're gonna line up that. Yeah, you have good, maybe some good chemistry eventually, but you don't know how the chemistry is to start with. And now he's starting to look good. He's going to be like a 6'7" guy. That's kind of what we brought him in case anybody goes down with an injury. And going back to the pairings too, Hedman and Ruda look really good together.
Yeah, and I'd love to see Jan Ruda back. And that's another thing that we might want to touch on is the fact that if the season gets canceled, like, what does that mean for the RFAs and the UFAs? Because you've got Jan Ruda, who was having a spectacular season before he went down, and he never got an opportunity to come back from injury. Meanwhile, you've got Anthony Cirelli, Eric Chernak, and Kel Sergachev, who all are RFAs. And, does their market go up or down based on this virus and what they might command? So at the end of the day, I thought that Hedman and Ruda were really, really good as a pairing. It really seemed that was probably Victor Hedman's best defense partner since prime Stroman. And, he did play with Stroman last year, but Stroman last year was not the same. And I think that you're seeing Hedman at his best when he's playing with a right-handed defenseman who is serviceable. And Jan Ruda has been more than serviceable. So Hedman's been able to shine.
Yeah. So going to the next game too, we played against Toronto, and we lost that game too, 2-1. And that's the thing that was lacking the most on this one is the power play. We've been struggling all season with it, but this one is really apparent, especially since Toronto scored both on the power play.
I would even say forget the power play. It was just really the first period that was so bad. In that first period, I think the shots were 16-2 or 1 or something like that. It was, very lopsided. That first period was not great. But if you look at the next two periods, the Lightning looked like, they played one of their best games. So the power play was definitely not great. But, as you mentioned, we've been dealing with that for a long time. It's been a little bit better in recent games, which is good, obviously besides that Toronto game. But I think the more concerning thing is, how do you come out in a game like that that's a potential, first round matchup, the more likely first round matchup, and just not have the energy to go and play such a bad first period? Now, this is not an alarm to me. This is not a reason to panic. I don't think, I fully expect during the playoffs the Lightning to come out and play extremely well throughout three periods. But that's something that bit us last year and showed up again here in the regular season, and I think is the most concerning thing from that game.
Yeah, and this was probably the worst period of hockey since the early December period against Montreal, where they went down, I believe it was 2-0 in the game and 18-0 in shots. This one was a little bit better. At the end of the first period, it was 18-6, and the score was only 1-0. But that was only because Vasilevsky was fantastic in the last game before the break. And I got really concerned as someone that was covering it because Eric Chernak went down halfway through the game, and he was, again, we talked about the defense pairings and how if one more person got injured, we would have been in a real big bind. And of course, it happened to be a right-handed defenseman that went down. But luckily, he came back into the game. Sergachev got hit in the head. Luckily, he came back in the game, which I don't even know how he did it after taking that Austin Matthews slap shot to the head. The main problem that I put down on the power play was the fact that they kept on passing it backwards. They've been doing that for years. It's really tiring. And I know their percentage looks good when you see it, but if you watch an actual power play for the Lightning right now. I know they don't have Stamkos, but the mixture of people that they're putting together just isn't working, and the things that they're doing on the power play, like passing it backwards, isn't working either.
Well, we talked about that many times too, where they just try to make those cute passes, and sometimes it works. Sometimes you find Kucherov in his spot, but it's not always going to work, and that's why they've been kind of struggling this year. They're trying to be too cute, and it doesn't work.
I think the positive take out of this game, though, is that they did bounce back and play extremely well in the second and third period. So it wasn't all bad, and they did show that they are that same team that they've been for most of this year, and have the ability to play well. It was just that first period that was a struggle, and hopefully that doesn't continue. I think this is interesting. The two games out of this recent stretch, Toronto and Boston were both such tough games. We had guys go down in Toronto, as you mentioned, and these are the two teams that they'll probably play in the first two rounds of the playoffs. So, it's just to say that it's going to be no easy road to the finals for the Lightning, that's for sure.
It felt like the injuries that we had against Toronto were sort of, incidental, getting hit in the head with a puck. And I believe the Cernak one was, I believe we blocked a shot. Like, that's going to happen, but at the same time, like, there's no malice behind it. If you face Boston, I'm afraid for your well-being, honestly. With some of the stuff that they pulled on Saturday, like, I don't even know what to expect during the playoffs, because it's going to amp up even more.
Yeah, and you're right. Those things were incidental against Toronto, but my point was, even though they are incidental, just that kind of game, Toronto, Boston, those two series, you go through Toronto, you have those incidental things happen because you're playing a much faster paced game against a team like Toronto, and then you have to go face Boston more than likely, and we know what happens in those kind of games. So you're already banged up a little bit probably from Toronto, and then having to go face Boston, assuming you get on that far, but it's going to be a tough road. Now, again, we'll see how everything plays out once we come back, hopefully come back from all this. And, who knows, when we come back from this, some teams could just fall off the face of the earth due to rust. So, next thing we know, we could be playing the Florida Panthers in the first round. So, we'll see.
Yeah, and, if you guys live in Florida, it's not that far from Tampa either to go to Sunrise. So you might as well make the trip. You can see both home and away games. And like you said, too, you never know about Florida because they've been streaky. Even with losing Trocheck in the trade, get Holla and Walmart, and that was a good trade for them as well.
They had a good deadline. I think in the short term, Carolina is the one that won that trade because I love Vincent Trocheck. I think he's a fantastic player. Got overshadowed by people like Barkov and Huberto, who are also completely underrated, but less so. So in the short term, I think Carolina won that trade, but in the long term, I think Florida did well. And if you look at Florida right now, they were told in the offseason to cut $10 million. So they might be a team that if this virus continues, they might have to either cut even more, or if the season ends early, they are going to have to find a way to get a team that is competitive for next season. So I don't envy the people in Florida's position.
So in that aspect, do you believe that the signing of Bobrovsky was a bad one, considering that was a $10 million contract?
Yeah, he has not been very good. He's been better as of late. But the real number one goalie right now is Chris Driedger, who is a 26-year-old rookie for them. And I want to say he has a save percentage in the 920s, which is just fantastic. And then you look at Bobrovsky, and his save percentage isn't even above 900. I really do not like Sergei Bobrovsky after what he did to us last year. But I really felt like that was a fluke because last year in the regular season, he was not great. This year in the regular season, he has not performed very well. It just seemed like it was just one time, and that one time happened to be against us.
Yeah, I don't know if I would. I think, obviously, if you have a chance to sign a good goaltender like that, you're going to do it. So, it doesn't surprise me that Florida ended up paying that much. Obviously, it's unfortunate for them that it's currently not working out. But, hey, maybe if they sneak into the first round of the playoffs and he ends up getting a start. Maybe he won't start, but he gets a start, and then he pulls another one of those fluke first rounds. Next thing you know, Florida's into the second round. So who knows? It's definitely, I think, disappointing for them, but only time will tell.
Do you guys have anything to add to this one?
No, I don't think so.
Not really in terms of like big things, but one of the things that I wanted to do was, I know the break is putting a lot of things on hold, and I hope this player has a better or more success as his if the season continues. But I was really impressed with Andre Palat against Toronto. He really drove play. He's been having a fantastic season. So, and he's struggled with injuries over the past couple of seasons, not this year, but before that. And I really hope that this break doesn't put a damper on the season that he's having. And I think that he's really living up to his potential. So, he's been one of the players that I've been really impressed with. And it's going to be really boring for the next month, to be honest.
Yeah, well. And I agree. Palat has been fantastic. He's been one of my favorite players for a while, even back, last year, 2 years ago, when people were starting to get down on Palat. He worked with Nikita Kucherov often to, try and get his game back up there, and he's done very well this season. So I don't think this situation will put too much damper on it. I think when he comes back, he'll continue to be the kind of player that he's been. Palat's one of those guys. Back when I wrote an article, saying who the underrated Lightning players are, Palat is one of those guys for me. He's a guy that you don't hear much about. He's not a fan favorite often. Because when you talk about fan favorites, it's Stamkos, Hedman, Vasilevsky, all those guys. But he has been a consistently great player for the Lightning, so he's been awesome.
Yeah, and you guys talking about underrated players. I think he's probably one of the most underrated in the NHL. I mean, he can easily be a top liner for most teams, and he has been a lot of times for the Lightning too this season. So, but yeah, that's about it. And like you said, it's going to be really boring. No sports, no basketball if you're into that, or of course no hockey, no spring training for baseball. That's been pushed back. So, if you guys have any Netflix recommendations, let us know. Have a good one, guys. Take care.